You ever had one of those nights where everything feels just a little too quiet, like the world has paused, and you're the only one awake to notice it? That's me always has been. I'm a night owl. Always have been. Always will be. It's not that I don't like mornings. They're fine if you're into sunshine and chirping birds. But there's something about nighttime, the way the air feels heavier. The shadows stretch longer, it's peaceful. Or at least, it used to be. So when I moved to this small town last month, I figured my nocturnal habits would come in handy. The job was simple enough. Managing inventory for a local store during late hours. No customers. No distractions, just me. Some shelves. And the hum of fluorescent lights. Perfect, right? At first glance, yeah, it seemed ideal. But now, sitting here recounting all this, I realize how I was. Let me back up a bit. My name's Alex, not Alexandra. Not Alexander, just Alex. People always ask if I prefer he or she, but honestly, I never cared much for labels. What matters is that I've spent most of my life moving from place to place. New cities, new jobs, new routine. It's kind of my thing. Some people hate change, but I thrive on it. Keeps things interesting, you know. Anyway, this latest move wasn't exactly by choice. Life threw me a curveball, a messy breakup, an expired lease, and a bank account that looked more like Monopoly money than actual savings. So when my cousin mentioned this opening in Willow Creek, I didn't think twice. Small towns are supposed to be safe, right? Quiet streets, friendly neighbors, maybe even a cute coffee shop where everyone knows your order before you step inside. That's what I pictured anyway. The first few days were uneventful, almost boring. The apartment I rented was nothing special, a studio with peeling wallpaper and creaky floorboards, but it had character. Plus, it backed onto this massive forest. You could practically hear the trees breathing at night. I'd sit by the window sometimes, staring out at the dark expanse, wondering what lay beyond. Not that I planned to find out. Forests freak me out. Always have. Too many places for things to hide. But work kept me busy. The store wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. And since I worked nights, I barely interacted with anyone except Mr. Grayson, the owner. He's a nice guy, though a little odd. Talks to himself sometimes. Mutters under his breath while counting receipts. Honestly, I didn't pay him much attention. Everyone's got quirks, right? Still, there was something comforting about the routine. Stock shelves, check inventory, lock up around midnight. Then, I'd take the long way home through the edge of the forest. There was this narrow path that wound along the tree line, lit only by the moonlight, filtering through the branches. It felt safe, somehow, predictable, until it didn't. Looking back, I should have noticed the signs sooner, the way the wind would pick up for no reason, rustling the leaves like whispers, or how the temperature dropped suddenly, even on warm summer nights. But I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination playing tricks on me. After all, forests are supposed to feel alive, aren't they? That changed one night. A week ago, maybe? I can't remember exactly. All I know is I left work later than usual. The streets were deserted, the kind of silence that makes your footsteps echo louder than they should. As I reached the edge of the forest, I hesitated. Something felt off, like the trees were leaning closer, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. I shook it off, told myself I was being ridiculous. But as I stepped onto the path, I heard it. A sound so faint I almost missed it, a soft creak, like wood groaning under pressure. I froze. My heart started pounding, and for a second I thought about turning back. But then I saw it. A door. Not just any door, an actual wooden door, set into the base of a massive oak tree. Its surface was weathered, cracked with age, and etched with strange symbols I couldn't make sense of. For a moment, I stood there, staring at it, trying to convince myself It wasn't real. Maybe someone built it as a prank, or maybe I was hallucinating. Either way, I knew one thing for sure. This wasn't normal. And yet, despite every instinct screaming at me to leave, I couldn't look away. There was something magnetic about that door, something that pulled at me, deep down in a way I couldn't explain. Against all logic, the door didn't make sense. I took a step forward. Not here, not now. I mean, who builds a door in the middle of a forest? And why carve it into a tree like that? It wasn't natural, nothing about it was. But as much as my brain screamed to turn around and walk away, my feet stayed rooted to the spot. My hand twitched, almost instinctively reaching out toward the handle before I caught myself. What was I doing? This wasn't me. I don't do reckless things. Yet there I was, standing inches from something that felt wrong. I forced myself to step back, shaking my head like I could physically shake off whatever spell the door had cast over me. It's just a prank, I muttered under my breath, though even saying it aloud didn't make it feel true. Still, I turned and walked home faster than usual, glancing over my shoulder every few steps. The forest seemed darker, somehow, heavier, like it was closing in on me. By the time I reached my apartment, I was sweating despite the cool night air. That should have been the end of it. Just another weird moment I could laugh about later, at least try to forget. But the next day, things started feeling off. At work, Mr. Grayson acted stranger than usual. He kept muttering to himself, louder this time, his voice low and gravelly. When I asked if everything was okay, he just stared at me for a second too long, his eyes glassy and unfocused. Then he said, "You shouldn't go wandering after dark." Wandering? I laughed nervously, brushing it off. Trust me, I stick to the path. He didn't respond, just went back to counting receipts, mumbling something I couldn't quite catch. Something about doors, or maybe I imagined it. Either way, his words stuck with me all night, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts like termites, chewing through wood. When I locked up the store that evening, I noticed something LC clipboard hanging crookedly on the wall near the back exit. Weird, because I always leave it perfectly aligned on the counter. Always. I chalked it up to being tired or distracted earlier. But when I grabbed it, the papers inside were out of order. Not just shuffled, completely rearranged, like someone had gone through them intentionally. Some pages were even torn along the edges, jagged rips that looked deliberate rather than accidental. I must have done it without realizing, I told myself, stuffing the clipboard into my bag. But deep down, I knew I hadn't. That clipboard hadn't left the wall since I'd hung it there 2 weeks ago. By the time I stepped outside, the unease had settled into my chest like a stone. The streets were empty again, the kind of silence that makes you hyper-aware of every sound, the crunch of gravel under your shoes, the distant hum of crickets, the faint rustle of leaves swaying in the breeze. Except the breeze stopped suddenly, just cut off mid-sway, leaving the trees eerily still. Even the crickets fell silent, plunging the world into an unnatural quiet. And then I heard it, a soft creak, like wood groaning under pressure. My stomach dropped. It was the same sound from the other night, the sound of the door. Only this time, I wasn't anywhere near the forest. I spun around, scanning the street behind me. Nothing moved. No cars, no people, no animals. Just shadows stretching across the pavement like spilled ink. "It's just the wind," I whispered, wrapping my arms tight around myself. Just the damn wind. But the hairs on the back of my neck wouldn't stop standing up. I quickened my pace, practically jogging toward the edge of the forest. The sooner I got home, the better. Except when I reached the path, something stopped me dead in my tracks. There, carved into the dirt beside the trail, were symbols. They matched the ones on the door. How had I missed them before? Had they been there all along? My mind raced, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. Kids messing around, maybe some kind of art project. But these weren't random doodles, they were precise, deliberate. Each mark looked ancient, like they belonged in a history book instead of fresh soil. I knelt down, running my fingers lightly over the grooves. They were cold, unnaturally so, even against the cool night air. And then I realized something worse. The symbols formed a pattern, a circle, broken only by a single line pointing straight ahead toward the forest. No, I said aloud, standing abruptly. No way. I'm not going back in there. But the path called to me anyway. Not loudly, not aggressively, just a whisper, tugging at the corners of my mind. Go see. Find out. You know you want to. I clenched my fists, nails digging into my palms. This is insane, I muttered, backing away slowly. I'm losing it. That's all this is. Except I didn't believe it. Not really, because deep down, I knew something bigger was at play, something I couldn't explain. And the worst part, whatever it wasn't done with me. I woke up with a headache so sharp, it felt like someone had taken a hammer to my skull. My dreams, or whatever they were, had been restless, filled with disjointed images of trees bending unnaturally, symbols glowing faintly in the dark, and that damn door creaking open just enough for me to see nothing, just emptiness beyond it. I sat up in bed, rubbing my temples, trying to shake off the lingering unease. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't ignore the feeling that something was watching me. I got ready for work on autopilot, avoiding the mirror because looking at myself felt too real somehow. Like if I stared too long, I'd see something behind me shadow, a figure, anything but not me. When I stepped outside, the air was heavier than usual, thick with humidity and the faint smell of earth after rain. Except it hadn't rained. Not last night, not any time recently. The sky was overcast, gray clouds pressing down like a lid on a pot about to boil over. By the time I reached the store, my nerves were frayed. Every step felt wrong, like I was walking into a trap I couldn't escape. Mr. Grayson was already there when I arrived, standing by the counter with his back to me. He didn't turn around when I said hello, just kept staring at something in his hands. As I approached, I realized it was a small wooden carving, a miniature version of the door I'd seen in the forest. Where did you get that? I blurted out before I could stop myself. He glanced up, startled, then quickly tucked the carving into his pocket. Found it, he mumbled, avoiding my gaze. Around here somewhere. Around here? I repeated, my voice rising slightly. What does that even mean? His expression hardened, and for a moment, he looked almost angry. Then, as quickly as it came, the anger faded, replaced by something softer, regret, maybe, fear. It was hard to tell. Listen, he said quietly, leaning closer. You need to stay away from the woods. Don't go near them. Don't look at them. Don't think about them. Understand? I wanted to laugh, to tell him he was being ridiculous, but the intensity in his eyes stopped me. This wasn't paranoia or superstition. Whatever he knew or thought he knew it terrified him. And now, it terrified me too. Work dragged on longer than usual that day. Every noise made me jump. The buzz of the fluorescent lights above, the clatter of boxes shifting on the shelves, even the sound of my own footsteps echoing through the empty aisles. At one point, I swore I heard whispering coming from the storage room, soft voices overlapping in a language I didn't recognize. When I opened the door, though, the room was empty, completely silent, except for the hum of the refrigerator in the corner. I told myself it was stress, lack of sleep, anything but what it actually felt like. Something unnatural lurking just beneath the surface of reality. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that the store itself was changing. Little things kept happening, things I couldn't explain. A display shelf that had been perfectly organized earlier was suddenly a mess. Items scattered across the floor, as if someone had rifled through them in a hurry. The security camera footage showed nothing unusual, just static-filled frames of an empty room. Then there was the clipboard again. This time, it wasn't just rearranged, it was gone entirely, vanished without a trace. I searched everywhere, retracing my steps, checking every drawer and cabinet, but it was nowhere to be found until later that evening when I locked up and headed home. There it was, sitting on the passenger seat of my car, exactly where I'd left it 2 nights ago, except I hadn't touched it since yesterday. Someone or something had moved it. My hands trembled as I picked it up, flipping through the pages. They were still out of order, some torn worse than before, others marked with fresh ink scribbles that definitely weren't mine. One page stood out, a crude sketch of the forest path leading to the tree with the door. Beneath it, scrawled in shaky handwriting, were the words, "Don't follow the line." "What the hell is going on?" I whispered, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The walk home was unbearable. Every shadow seemed alive, shifting and twisting in ways shadows shouldn't. The streetlights flickered erratically, casting strobe-like flashes that made it impossible to focus, and the temperature had dropped suddenly, so cold I could see my breath fogging in front of me. But it wasn't consistent. 1 second, I'd feel like I was freezing. The next, sweat would break out along my spine. When I reached the edge of the forest, I froze. The symbols carved into the dirt were deeper now, darker, as if someone had traced over them repeatedly. But that wasn't the worst part. Standing at the beginning of the path was a figura man, tall and gaunt, wearing a tattered coat that flapped in a breeze I couldn't feel. His face was obscured by the brim of his hat, but I could sense his eyes boring into me, pinning me in place. "Who are you?" I called out, my voice cracking, despite my best effort to sound brave. He didn't answer. Instead, he raised a hand, pointing toward the forest, toward the door. Panic surged through me, raw and electric. "No," I said firmly, taking a step backward. "I'm not doing this. I'm not playing your game." But the figure didn't move, didn't blink, just stood there, unmoving, unblinking, until finally he lowered his arm and melted into the shadows like smoke, dissipating in the wind. I ran the rest of the way home, heart pounding in my chest, legs burning with exertion. By the time I slammed the apartment door shut behind me, I was gasping for air, tears streaming down my face. I locked the door, double-checked the windows, and pulled the curtains tight, desperate to block out the world outside. For a while, I sat on the floor, knees drawn to my chest, trying to calm myself down. But the silence inside was worse than the chaos outside. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like footsteps. Every rustle of the curtains felt like movement. And then, just as I started convincing myself it was all in my head, I heard it, the creak, that same god-forsaken creak of wood, groaning under pressure. It wasn't coming from the forest this time. It was coming from inside my apartment. I grabbed the nearest heavy object, a cast iron skillet, and crept toward the source of the sound. The hallway leading to my bedroom was pitch black, the light switch useless, no matter how many times I flipped it. My pulse thundered in my ears, drowning out everything else. When I reached the doorway, I hesitated, clutching the skillet like a lifeline. Then, with a deep breath, I swung the door open, and there it was. The door, the same one from the forest, embedded in the wall where my closet used to be. Its surface was cracked and splintered, the symbols etched into the wood glowing faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat. Beyond it, darkness stretched endlessly, impenetrable and suffocating. "This isn't real," I whispered, backing away slowly. This can't be real. But it was. And it was waiting. I couldn't move. My legs felt like they were encased in concrete, rooted to the spot, despite every instinct screaming at me to run. The door pulsed faintly, its glow casting eerie shadows across the walls of my apartment. It wasn't just light, it was alive, throbbing with an energy that made my skin crawl. Each pulse sent a wave of nausea through me, as if the air itself was vibrating at a frequency too low for human ears, but perfectly attuned to terror. "What do you want?" I whispered, my voice trembling so badly it barely sounded like words. "Why are you here?" The symbols carved into the wood shifted slightly, rearranging themselves into patterns I didn't recognize. They seemed to writhe, twisting and curling like living things trapped beneath the surface. And then, without warning, the handle began to turn. "No," I shouted, clutching the skillet tighter. "Stay out." But the handle kept moving, slow and deliberate, as though whoever was on the other side had all the time in the world. A cold draft seeped through the cracks around the frame, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. It filled the room, choking me, making it hard to breathe. My chest tightened, panic clawing its way up my throat like a living thing. The door creaked open. At first, there was nothing, just darkness spilling out like ink spreading across paper. But then, shapes started to form within it. Figures, tall and gaunt, their outlines blurred and indistinct. Their eyes glowed faintly, hollow pits of light that burned into my soul. One by one they stepped forward, emerging from the void like ghosts materializing from smoke. My grip on the skillet faltered as I stumbled backward, tripping over furniture in my haste to put distance between us. My heart pounded so loudly I could hear it echoing in my skull, each beat drowning out rational thought. "Get back!" I screamed, swinging the skillet wildly. "Stay away from me!" They didn't stop, didn't even flinch. Instead, they spread out, surrounding me, cutting off any chance of escape. Their movements were unnatural, jerky, and disjointed, like marionettes controlled by invisible strings. The air grew colder with every step they took, frost forming on the walls and floor, crystallizing my breath into tiny clouds that hung suspended, lunged suddenly, faster than I could react. Its hand shot out, long fingers brushing against my arm. The touch was ice cold, burning like dry ice against my skin. I yanked myself free, stumbling sideways, only to collide with another figure behind me. This one leaned close, its face inches from mine. Its mouth opened impossibly wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth that clicked together like broken machinery. A sound came out, a guttural growl, mixed with something akin to laughter, but no words. Just noise, raw and primal, designed to instill fear. "Leave me alone," I shrieked, swinging the skillet again. This time, it connected, striking the creature square in the head. There was a sickening crunch, followed by silence. For a moment I thought I'd hurt it, maybe even killed it. But when the figure straightened, its head lolled grotesquely to one side, dangling by a thread of sinew. And yet, it kept coming, undeterred, unharmed. Desperation took hold. I bolted toward the door leading to the hallway, hoping to make it outside before they could stop me. But the figures moved faster than I anticipated, blocking my path before I could reach it. Trapped, I turned in circles, searching for some way out, some weapon I could use. That's when I saw it. The carving Mr. Grayson had shown me earlier. It was lying on the kitchen counter, glowing faintly its wooden surface etched with the same symbols now pulsing on the door. Without thinking, I grabbed it and hurled it at the nearest figure. The instant it hit the ground, the room erupted in chaos. The creatures screeched, covering their glowing eyes as if blinded by the sudden burst of light. The door slammed shut with a deafening crash, the symbols on its surface flaring brightly before fading completely. For a brief second, everything went silent, and then the walls began to shake. Plaster cracked and crumbled, raining down in chunks as the entire apartment groaned under the strain. The floor tilted dangerously, sending me sliding toward the edge of the abyss where the door had been. I clawed at anything I could grab, a chair leg, a tablecloth, but nothing held firm as I teetered on the brink, staring into the endless void below. I realized what was happening. The apartment wasn't collapsing. It was being pulled into the forest, into the tree, into whatever nightmare dimension lay beyond the door. With a final desperate effort, I latched onto the edge of the doorway, clinging to it with everything I had. The wind howled around me, whipping my hair into my face as the suction grew stronger. Below me, the figures reached upward, their gnarled hands grasping at my ankles. One of them managed to snag my shoe, pulling hard enough to nearly dislocate my knee. I kicked frantically, finally breaking free, but not before losing the shoe entirely. "I'm not going," I screamed, tears streaming down my face. Above me, the ceiling split open, revealing the night sky. Stars twinkled mockingly, indifferent to my plight. And then, just as I felt my strength giving out, a voice cut through the chaos. "Let go." It was Mr. Grayson. He stood in the gaping hole where the ceiling used to be, silhouetted against the stars. In his hands, he held a lantern, its flame flickering weakly but casting just enough light to illuminate his face. His expression was grim, resigned, as if he'd seen this before and knew exactly how it ended. "You don't understand," I sobbed, my arms shaking violently. "If I let go, I'll fall." "You're already falling," he said calmly. "This isn't your world anymore. Let go, or take the next step. Either way, you won't survive." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. Was this it? Was this how it ended? Dangling between two worlds, neither willing to claim me. The choice was clear, though I hated it. With a cry of anguish, I released my grip and plummeted downward. The fall was endless. At least, that's how it felt. Time stretched and warped, each second dragging on like an eternity as I plummeted through the void. The wind roared in my ears, drowning out everything else, the screeches of the creatures, the creak of the door, even my own screams. My body twisted uncontrollably, limbs flailing, as gravity pulled me deeper into the abyss. Just when I thought I couldn't take another moment of free fall, I hit something solid, hard. Pain exploded across my back and shoulders, knocking the breath from my lungs. For a few seconds, I lay there, dazed, staring up at nothing. No sky, no ceiling, just an expanse of blackness so complete it felt suffocating. But beneath me, the ground was cold and damp, the smell of wet earth filling my nostrils. Slowly, painfully, I pushed myself upright, wincing as every muscle protested, or at least somewhere that looked like it. The trees loomed overhead, their branches twisting together to block out any trace of moonlight or stars. The air was thick with humidity, heavy enough to make breathing feel like a chore. And yet, despite the oppressive atmosphere, there was something eerily familiar about this place. Something comforting, almost nostalgic. That familiarity scared me more than anything else. "Where am I?" I whispered, though I already knew the answer. This wasn't my world anymore. Whether Mr. Grayson had been right or wrong about surviving, one thing was certain: I hadn't escaped. Not really. Whatever had pulled me into the void hadn't let me guide, had simply relocated me. A soft rustling drew my attention. Turning slowly, I spotted movement among the tree-saw figure, stepping cautiously into view. It wasn't one of the gaunt, monstrous beings from before. This was human-shaped, shorter, slighter. As it moved closer, I recognized him immediately. Mr. Grayson. He looked different here though. Older, wearier, his face lined with exhaustion that went beyond mere age. His eyes, once glassy and distant, now burned with clarity and regret. In his hand, he still held the lantern, its flame flickering weakly, but casting enough light to illuminate the space around us. "You shouldn't have come," he said softly, his voice tinged with sorrow. "Not yet." "What is this place?" I demanded, my voice shaking despite my attempt to sound brave. "What did you do to me?" "I didn't do anything," he replied, shaking his head. "This isn't my doing. This is..." He trailed off, glancing over his shoulder, as if expecting something or someone to appear behind him. "This is bigger than both of us." "Then tell me what's going on," I snapped, anger cutting through my fear. "Why does everyone keep talking in riddles? Why are those things after me? What do they want?" "They're not after you," he said, his tone grave. "They're guarding something. Something ancient. Something dangerous." He paused, meeting my gaze directly. "And somehow, you've become part of it." My stomach churned. Part of what? He didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small object, the wooden carving of the door. Holding it out to me, he said, "Take this. It'll protect you for now, but don't trust it completely. Nothing here is what it seems." I hesitated, staring at the carving. Its surface was smooth and warm to the touch, unlike the splintered, pulsing monstrosity embedded in my apartment wall. Reluctantly, I took it, clutching it tightly in my fist. The moment my fingers closed around it, the forest seemed to shift subtly, the shadows retreating slightly, as if giving me room to breathe. "Now, listen carefully," Mr. Grayson continued, his voice urgent. "You need to find the source, the origin of the symbols. If you can reach it, you might stand a chance of breaking the cycle. But be warned, the path won't lead where you expect, and not everything will stay dead once you wake it." Before I could ask what he meant, a loud crack split the air, echoing through the trees like thunder. Mr. Grayson's expression darkened, and he turned sharply toward the sound. "They're coming," he muttered under his breath, then louder to me, "Run, don't stop, don't look back." "Wait, where do I go?" I shouted, panic rising again. He pointed toward a narrow trail winding between the trees. Unlike the path I'd taken before, this one shimmered faintly, as if illuminated by moonlights that didn't exist. "Follow the glow," he instructed. "It'll guide you for a while." Another crack, closer this time. Shadows began to stir, coalescing into shapes that were all too familiar. Without waiting for further explanation, I bolted down the trail, clutching the carving like a lifeline. Behind me, I heard Mr. Grayson shout something, words I couldn't make out, but I didn't dare turn around. The creatures were gaining on me, their guttural growls growing louder with each passing second. The trail twisted and turned unpredictably, forcing me to duck under low-hanging branches and leap over roots jutting out of the ground. Despite the chaos, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being herded, guided along a predetermined route. Every step felt deliberate, as if the forest itself was alive and steering me toward some unseen destination. Finally, after what felt like hours, the trail opened up into a clearing. At its center stood a massive oak tree, its trunk gnarled and twisted with age. Embedded within it was a door an exact replica of the one I'd seen in my apartment, except this time it was wide open. Beyond it, a dim light flickered invitingly, pulsing in rhythm with the beating of my heart. For a moment, I hesitated. Was this the source Mr. Grayson had mentioned? Or was it another trap? Another layer of the creatures burst into the clearing, their glowing eyes locking onto me like predators cornering prey. There was no time to think, no time to second guess. With a deep breath, I stepped through the doorway. The world dissolved around me. When I opened my eyes again, I was lying on the floor of my apartment. The walls were intact, the furniture untouched. Even the clipboard sat neatly on the counter, exactly where I'd left it days ago. Everything looked normal to normal, except for one detail. The door was gone, completely vanished, leaving only smooth plaster behind. Had it all been a dream? A hallucination brought on by stress and sleep deprivation? I wanted to believe it, desperately. But the carving in my hand told a different story. It was real, solid, warm against my palm, and the symbols etched into its surface pulsed faintly, as if alive. As I stared at it, a single thought echoed in my mind. Unbidden and unwelcome. Was it all in my head, or is something still out there, waiting for me to return? I thought I'd forget it all once I left, once I woke up, but now every shadow feels like it's watching me.